4,000 years ago, about 2000 BC, is when the first Chinese dynasty of Xia arose, arguably one of the first major nation-states to ever exist, only a few hundred years younger than the oldest kingdom in Egypt, and since then China has been ruled by a series of different powers or dynasties, some lasting hundreds of years, some only a generation. However, China wasn't always known as China, as this term is actually derived from the Indians referring to the Qin dynasty of the 3rd century BC, while the Chinese typically refer to their nation as Zhongguo, while the dominant ethnic group in China, what we call the Han, are referred to as the Hanzu, in reference to the Han dynasty, the largest and most powerful dynasty up to that period. But is Chinese even a single language? Kinda, but not really. Chinese is a dialect continuum, meaning there's a chain or web of intricately connected dialects, some of which may be mutually intelligible across vast distances, while others that are spoken relatively close to one another may find it impossible to understand each other. This is a similar situation to the Hindi dialects spoken in northern India, Arabic dialects spoken across the Middle East and North Africa, and even, arguably, English speakers. I mean, try putting a person from Scotland and Jamaica in the same room and see if they can form a conversation. The region that would become China was not always dominated by the Han, however, as before this there were a multitude of Austronesian, Austroasiatic, Hmong-Mien, and Tai-Kadai peoples that inhabited the southern portion of China, yet over hundreds or thousands of years were gradually incorporated into the greater Chinese nation, adopting Chinese dialects as a part of the Sinicization of the area, and this has contributed to the linguistic and cultural diversity seen throughout the Han people, but especially in southern China. Moderate numbers of minorities still do exist in mainland China, however, especially in the southwestern region, which is predominantly inhabited by Tibetic, Thai, and Hmong peoples, with there also being a rather large Islamic Uyghur community in the autonomous region of Xinjiang, Mongols in Inner Mongolia, and Manchus and Koreans in the northeast. But in total, these still only amount to less than 10% of the total population, despite numbering in the tens of millions. Over the past couple thousand years, ethnic Han from China have not only been settling in southern China, but have also been settling even further than this, with small numbers arriving in both mainland and maritime Southeast Asia as far back as the records go. And this was accelerated during the European colonial age, as the British imported large numbers of Chinese, as well as Indians, into many of their Southeast Asian colonies. The original people group of maritime Southeast Asia, the Austronesians, actually originated from the island of Taiwan, spreading out south to the Philippines and eventually all of the Malay archipelago, many islands in the South Pacific, and even as far away as Madagascar, creating a loosely affiliated patchwork of extremely diverse peoples. The Taiwanese aboriginals, often called Formosans, were initially under the rule of a small number of Europeans, such as the Dutch or Spanish, before being invaded and conquered by Chinese warlords from the mainland of China in the 1600s, quickly displacing the indigenous inhabitants into the interior of the island and creating a Sinitic, meaning Chinese-based culture. Interestingly, Taiwan is not the only example of mass migration from mainland China Sinicizing an island, as there's also Hainan in the south, which was originally inhabited by Thai-speaking Li people before being incorporated into Guangxi and later Guangdong provinces, while Taiwan was administered by Fujian province on the mainland under the Qing dynasty. However, in the late 1800s, Taiwan would soon be annexed once again by an outside power, this time by the Japanese, who would rule over the island for half a century until the end of World War II. Many Europeans also established protectorates on the coast of mainland China, with the two most prominent being the Portuguese territory of Macau, established in the 16th century, and the British Hong Kong, established in the 19th century. Other territories in Southeast Asia had very large Chinese populations, such as Malaysia, which at one point was nearly 50% Chinese, however were never directly under Chinese rule, although I imagine it could have been very easy for parts of Southeast Asia to have fallen under direct Chinese rule and eventually become Sinicized, similar to what happened in southern China thousands of years ago. Singapore, which has been majority Chinese since the 1830s, is an interesting example of a Chinese country outside of China, which, hey, could have been an alternate title to this video, but considering the controversy surrounding just what constitutes the country of China, it probably wouldn't have gone down well for anyone. You see, after World War II, we unfortunately saw the division of many nations under the overview of the UN, such as the divisions of Germany or Korea, but the division of China was actually the result of an ongoing civil war between the ruling nationalists, or Kuomintang, and the communist guerrillas, or CCP, a conflict which initially began in 1927 until the Japanese invasion of China, and then would be resumed after World War II. After being heavily depleted after decades of fighting and a brutal occupation by Japanese forces, the Kuomintang was defeated and fled to the island of Taiwan, which, along with a few of the surrounding islands, continued as the Republic of China, while the mainland declared itself to be the People's Republic of China, similar to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, better known as North and South Korea, respectively. Funny how that works, isn't it? Similarly to the Korean War, the Chinese Civil War is technically still ongoing, as neither side has admitted defeat or any concessions whatsoever, and continue to claim to be the sole legitimate government of China. However, the militarization between the two governments is nowhere near as extreme or hostile as those in the Korean Peninsula. One interesting quirk is that, unlike the People's Republic, aka the PRC, the Republic, aka ROC, still claims sovereignty over many regions that haven't been a part of China since the Qing era, such as Mongolia or Tuva in Russia, but presumably this is a political move in order to avoid concessions. Does Taiwan, a country of only 20 million people, realistically expect to get into a war and conquer all of the mainland, a country with 60 times more inhabitants at over 1.3 billion? Of course not. There are many different political views in Taiwan today regarding the future of the country, with many wishing to abandon the territorial claims to the mainland entirely and simply declare independence as the Republic of Taiwan, while others hope for eventual unification of their governments if and when China accepts democracy, while a far smaller minority wish for an immediate annexation into China, either as a province or a special administrative region with a high degree of autonomy, similar to what occurred to the former European port territories. It actually wasn't until the late 1990s that Hong Kong and Macau were transferred over to the PRC, and since then have had a much larger degree of freedom of governance than other areas of China, and in many ways still do act as independent countries, although clearly, judging by recent events, all is not well with this particular arrangement. Thus establishes the precariously balanced realm of Greater China, or the Sinosphere, the collection of predominantly Chinese-descended territories that have close cultural ties due to having been descended from the same people. However, the political differences are utterly massive. There is, however, one more territory in the Sinosphere that is often glossed over, and that is the overseas territory of Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, formerly administered by Singapore but transferred to Australia after World War II, with the majority of the island's 1,800 inhabitants being descended from Chinese and Malay migrants from Southeast Asia. There is still quite a high degree of ethnic diversity in many of these Sinosphere territories, however, especially in Singapore, which has fluctuated from a mostly Malay island to quite the diverse nation. Despite an alarmingly low fertility rate of less than one child per woman for Chinese Singaporeans, literally one of the lowest rates in the entire world, the Chinese Singaporean population is maintained by an ever-stable influx of ethnic Chinese migrants from the PRC and Taiwan. Although there is evidence that the proportion of Chinese in Singapore and other Sinosphere territories is less than what official statistics imply, as there are growing numbers of migrants from South and Southeast Asia, and even the West in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, which is rapidly increasing racial and ethnic diversity in these areas. In fact, in the whole of the Sinosphere, for the past 3 or 4 decades, there has been an unprecedented decline in fertility not seen anywhere else in the past century, for various reasons, as even the West took longer than this to reach sub-replacement level fertility rates, as I discussed in a recent video, with the share of the world's population located in China predicted to plummet in the next century. Ethnic minorities from the mainland, such as Uyghurs, Zhuang, and Manchu, are extremely underrepresented in the overseas Chinese community, less than 1% in most cases, which is probably why most outsiders assume that China is a completely homogeneous state. However, there are exceptions to this, such as the large community of Yanbian Koreans from northeast China who have moved to South Korea, or ethnic Tibetans who have moved to India, but in Southeast Asia, virtually the entirety of the Chinese communities are of Han Chinese or Hui descent. In a previous video over the ethnic homogeneity of most East Asian countries, I mentioned near the end that even though East Asia is one of the most ethnically homogeneous regions on Earth, it has a very high degree of religious diversity, and actually has had for quite some time now. As in all East Asian countries, but especially the Sinosphere, there is a high degree of fluidity and syncretism between various beliefs, traditions, holidays, holy sites, deities, morals, fables, and practices that all stem from wildly different sources, creating a sort of melting pot that makes it rather difficult to classify distinct religions. For instance, in Japan, the traditionally dominant religious practice, Shintoism, is believed to be native to the Yamato people, while Buddhism was introduced due to influence from China in the 6th century AD and quickly took hold in the population as well, with the majority of the Japanese population incorporating elements from both of these philosophies and taking part in religious practices pertaining to either. Although conversely, only a minority of Japan's population actually claims any affiliation with an organized religion, with many not even believing in any god. So one could say that Japan is simultaneously a Shinto, Buddhist, and atheist society. Similarly, a large chunk of the Chinese population still adheres to some aspects of their traditional ethno-religious folk practices, largely consisting of ancestral veneration or nature worship, but a large proportion of the population has also incorporated elements of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, even if only a minority claim affiliation with a particular religious body. So it is quite difficult to draw the line between certain religious groups, as those who identify with any form of Buddhism are actually only a minority in mainland China, less than 20%, with nearly half of the population identifying as irreligious, although really this proportion is unknown, since, ironically, the PRC government doesn't recognize traditional Chinese religions as legitimate, and of the religions it does recognize, they are vastly undercounted in official enumerations. For example, officially only 0.4% of China's population is Muslim, but the real percentage is likely 4 or 5 times this number. So yes, in conclusion, the Sinosphere is a very interesting, albeit confusing and controversial situation. So when you use the term Chinese, you need to specify whether you're talking about these guys, or maybe all of them. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Sinosphere nations, and for today's poll, let me know which specific territory you'd like to learn more about. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.